The applause rolled through the ballroom before the orchestra even swelled. 200 elite guests were holding their breath for the first dance. The bride's custom silk gown caught the chandelier light perfectly. The groom was probably tearing up. The champagne was probably flawless. Grace Vance wasn't tasting any of it. She sat at the absolute edge of the room, isolated in plain sight, an empty chair beside her, a plated dinner getting cold somewhere between the toasts and the cake cutting. In her head, she was running a forensic audit on the Vance family trust. On her shoulders, a deep green silk dress she had bought herself. She wasn't clapping, she was calculating, because that was what Grace did. In the shadows of the spotlight, sitting quietly while her family pretended she didn't exist, she held things together. She paid the debts. She had secretly wired the $90,000 for the very venue they were dancing in, and then let her stepmother push her to the margins of the room. 200 people were celebrating. Not a single family member cared that she was sitting alone. Almost not one. The man who stepped away from the crowd to claim the empty chair beside her was not family. He wasn't even supposed to care. But Chin High Park had built a tech empire by seeing exactly what people worked hardest to hide. A pristine place card at the head table, deliberately flipped face down, told him everything he needed to know about who they were trying to erase. And a billionaire didn't get to the top by ignoring the most valuable person in the room. Table 18 was not a place of honor. It was a geographic insult. Positioned behind a colossal marble pillar at the furthest edge of the grand ballroom, it existed in the shadows where the waitstaff congregated and the air conditioning blew the coldest. Grace Vance sat completely alone, the deep emerald silk of her dress a stark contrast to the vast, empty white linen of the tablescape. The coffee in front of her had stopped steaming an hour ago. She ignored it, her eyes locked on the glowing screen of her laptop, which she had opened right next to her untouched dinner plate. On the screen, the numbers didn't lie. The Vance family estate ledger was a bleeding wound. Victoria's latest essential wedding expenses had quietly drained another $20,000 from the trust. Grace typed a command, her keystrokes silent and precise, locking down a spreadsheet cell. 100 feet across the polished floor, the music swelled. 200 elite guests cheered as Chloe, radiant and entirely oblivious, twirled in the center of the room. Grace looked up for a fraction of a second. She had secretly paid for the imported orchids draping the ceiling. She had paid for the 12-tier cake. She had even funded the silk gown her half-sister was currently dancing in. And her reward was Table 18. Deliberate, orchestrated erasure. She wasn't crying. Anger required energy she couldn't afford to waste. She was simply working. Across the expanse of the ballroom, at the velvet-draped head table, the champagne was flowing aggressively. Chin Hei Park sat perfectly still amid the chaos of the bridal party. As the groom's primary business partner, he was a man whose time was measured in millions, and he found the entire spectacle deeply inefficient. He took a slow sip of his drink, his dark, sharp gaze scanning the tables. That was when he saw it. Directly across from him, nestled between a laughing groomsman and Victoria's towering floral centerpiece, sat a single, pristine place card. It hadn't accidentally fallen over. It had been deliberately, meticulously flipped face down against the velvet tablecloth, a calculated void at the family table. Chin Hei did not believe in accidents. He believed in data, and a purposefully erased family member at a $90,000 event was a glaring anomaly. He stood up, smoothly buttoning his tuxedo jacket. He didn't excuse himself to the people clamoring for his attention. He simply walked away from the flashing cameras and the noise. He moved through the crowd with quiet authority, tracing the perimeter of the ballroom. His eyes bypassed the opulent displays and the dancing socialites, searching the absolute margins of the room. He found her behind the pillar. Table 18. She wasn't weeping over her exclusion. She was working, entirely self-contained. Chin Hei stopped a few feet away, observing the rigid set of her shoulders. He didn't offer pity. Instead, he reached out and pulled back the empty chair beside her. The chair beside her shifted slightly as Chin Hei pulled it out and sat down. He didn't speak. He didn't ask if the seat was taking or offer a polite, empty greeting. He simply occupied the space. His presence, a sudden, grounding weight in her otherwise isolated corner of the room. Grace didn't immediately look up from her screen. She didn't have the luxury of being distracted. 7 years ago, her father's heart had simply stopped. In the chaotic aftermath, the Vance family hadn't mourned, they had panicked. Victoria hadn't looked at her stepdaughter with shared grief, she had handed over a stack of past due notices. Grace was 21 then, freshly graduated, and suddenly the only structural beam holding up a crumbling facade. She had taken the ledger, she had paid the mortgages, she had funded the illusion of Victoria's generational wealth, working exhausting hours at a corporate forensics firm while her stepmother complained about the quality of the hors d'oeuvres at the country club. And then came the wedding, just 1 week ago. The venue had threatened to cancel the entire event. Victoria had quietly overdrawn the primary trust, funneling the necessary deposits into a luxury bridal suite upgrade and imported swan ice sculptures instead of paying the actual venue fee. Grace remembered the frantic, weeping phone call from Chloe, the hysteria, the implicit, heavy expectation that Grace would step in and fix it. Because Grace always fixed it. She had opened her personal banking app in the dead of night. She had stared at the balance, a private fund painstakingly built over 5 long years. It was her escape route. It was a first-class ticket to Seoul and a month of absolute freedom, a chance to breathe in a city where no one knew her name or demanded her money. Instead, she had typed in the routing number for the Meridian Grand Ballroom, $90,000, a single, irreversible wire transfer that zeroed out her dream to finance her sister's perfect day. And this was her return on investment. The ink on the final venue receipt was barely dry, yet Victoria had explicitly instructed the coordinator to seat her at the utility table. "Your work laptop just ruins the aesthetic, darling, and we simply ran out of room at the head table. You understand." She understood perfectly. Grace hit enter on her spreadsheet, finalizing the reconciliation of Victoria's latest unauthorized withdrawal. Beside her, Chin-hae remained entirely silent. He wasn't watching the dancers or checking his phone. He was looking at the glowing screen of her laptop, observing the brutal, undeniable mathematics of her sacrifice playing out in black and white. He didn't offer a meaningless platitude. He didn't offer a wealthy man's pity. He just sat with her, the first person in 7 years to actually see the heavy lifting happening in the dark. 3 hours before the first dance, the hidden zipper on Chloe's custom silk gown had seized entirely. The bridal suite had instantly descended into chaos. Tears threatened the pristine makeup. Victoria had stood frozen, uselessly clutching a glass of champagne. Grace had simply stepped in. She didn't offer empty reassurances or join the chorus of panic. She found the emergency sewing kit, systematically realigned the silk track, and secured the clasp with steady, practiced hands. 30 minutes later, when the head caterer nervously announced that the champagne tower logistics were failing and the timeline was severely delayed, Grace didn't blink. She walked directly into the chaotic kitchen, completely restructured the reception schedule on a cocktail napkin, and authorized a 15% overtime premium to the staff. The crises were dismantled silently. The illusion of a flawless, effortless evening was preserved. And as the heavy mahogany doors finally opened for the grand reception, Victoria had intercepted her. There was no gratitude in her stepmother's eyes, only a cold, calculating assessment of Grace's deep green dress and the leather laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Victoria had placed a manicured hand on Grace's arm, her smile tight and strictly for the photographers. "Your work things just ruin the aesthetic at the head table, darling, and we simply ran out of room. I've had the coordinator set up a quiet spot for you in the back. You understand." Victoria hadn't sent Grace to the basement, despite what the original floor plans might have suggested. That would have required answering questions if a guest noticed she was missing entirely. She had done something far more deliberate. She had relegated her to the absolute fringe of the ballroom, behind a colossal marble pillar, table 18. She had forced Grace to sit in plain sight, perfectly isolated, a silent spectator to the $90,000 celebration she had single-handedly built. Grace had understood perfectly. She had taken her laptop, walked to the margins of the room, and vanished without a sound. Now that imposed isolation was broken, the silence at table 18 stretched between Grace and Chin-hye, thick and entirely devoid of the tension that usually accompanied uninvited company. He didn't ask about the ledger on her screen, he didn't demand her attention, or try to make small talk over the distant sound of the orchestra. He merely anchored the space, sitting quietly beside her, offering a radical, silent defiance to the boundaries her family had tried to draw. The orchestra transitioned into a slower, heavier waltz. The shift in tempo rippled through the grand ballroom, pulling the remaining guests onto the floor in a wash of silk and diamonds. At the absolute fringe of the room, isolated behind the marble pillar, the celebration felt miles away. Chin-hye did not try to fill the quiet. Powerful men usually abhorred silence. They used words to dominate, to negotiate, to claim space. Chin-hye used silence as a baseline. He settled into the chair beside her, resting his arm on the pristine, empty white tablecloth. He didn't ask what she was working on. He didn't offer a polite apology on behalf of the groom's new family, because pity was entirely useless, and he suspected Grace Vance had zero patience for it. Instead, he simply shared the isolation. Grace kept her eyes on her screen. The initial shock of him claiming the seat had passed, replaced by a cautious, calculating awareness. She was accustomed to being invisible. She was used to being acknowledged only when a crisis required her skill set or her bank account. To have a billionaire sitting at her table demanding absolutely nothing from her was an anomaly her logic couldn't immediately process. She typed another sequence of numbers, finalizing the estate ledger. Chin-hye listened to the sharp, rhythmic click of her keys. It was a grounding counterpoint to the sweeping, extravagant strings of the orchestra playing just 50 feet away. The catering staff is falling behind on the champagne rotation. Chin-hye murmured softly, his voice low and completely devoid of small talk. He wasn't looking at her laptop. His dark gaze was fixed on the distant crowd, watching Victoria glide across the floor with a practiced, predatory smile. Grace didn't miss a beat, her eyes still on the screen. Then someone should notify the floor manager. It's what they're paid for. I didn't pay for this wedding. Chin-hye replied evenly, finally turning his head to look at her directly. You did. Grace's hands stopped moving. The cursor blinked on the glowing screen, a steady pulse in the sudden tension. She finally lifted her head, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. There was no judgment in his expression. There was no sympathetic tilt to his head. There was only absolute, unnerving comprehension. He had seen the flipped place card. He had observed the deliberate exclusion. He had done the math. For the first time all evening, Grace didn't feel the crushing need to manage a crisis or brace for a demand. The silence between them settled once more, no longer heavy with the sting of isolation, but anchored by an unspoken, mutual recognition. She let out a slow breath, looked back at her screen, and resumed typing, allowing him to sit quietly in her corner of the room. The quiet didn't last. The sound of sharp heels clicking against polished marble heralded Victoria's approach before her shadow crossed table 18. She wasn't alone. Trailing behind her were two prominent Chicago socialites, clutching crystal flutes of champagne and casting amused, condescending glances toward the isolated corner behind the pillar. "Grace, darling, there you are." Victoria's voice carried that sickeningly sweet pitch reserved exclusively for public performances. She paused at the edge of the table, her eyes darting over Grace's laptop. I was just telling the Montgomerys how relentless you are with your little administrative hobbies. Even at your own sister's $90,000 wedding reception, you simply insist on hiding away with your spreadsheets. She let out a theatrical, airy laugh, expecting her companions to join in. We offered her a place at the front, of course, but she's always been so painfully antisocial. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't offer a defensive explanation, nor did she bother calling out the blatant lie. She simply closed her laptop screen with a quiet, decisive click. The soft snap echoed in the small space between them. She slid the laptop into her leather briefcase, zipped it shut, and stood up with effortless grace. Her emerald dress caught the dim light, its understated elegance far outpacing Victoria's frantic, over-accessorized ensemble. "Enjoy the rest of the evening, Victoria," Grace said evenly, her voice entirely devoid of anger, bitterness, or warmth. Before Victoria could deliver another rehearsed jab, her gaze shifted past Grace's shoulder and froze. Chin Hae Park stood up smoothly beside table 18. He adjusted his jacket, his stature easily commanding the space. He did not say a single word to Victoria. He didn't even grant her the courtesy of eye contact. His expression was absolute granite, cold, impenetrable, and deeply unimpressed. Victoria's mouth opened slightly, the color visibly draining from her face as she recognized the global tech investor every elite guest upstairs had been desperate to corner. The silence that fell over her was instant and devastating. Grace turned and walked toward the grand exit, her head held high, her posture unyielding. She didn't look back. Behind her, the steady, deliberate cadence of dress shoes followed her path. Chin Hae Park walked 2 steps behind her, a towering, silent witness, marking her exit and leaving Victoria's carefully curated illusion completely shattered in their wake. The humid night air hit them the moment they cleared the venue's heavy glass doors. The valet was already sprinting toward a sleek black town car idling at the edge of the curb. Grace had planned to order a ride, stopping at the pavement with her leather briefcase heavy against her side. Chin Hae bypassed the open door of his vehicle, turning to face her. He simply gestured to the leather interior. It wasn't a demand, nor was it a polite social obligation. It was an offering of sanctuary. Grace didn't hesitate. She slid into the quiet, climate-controlled space, the chaos of the Meridian Grand Ballroom finally severed as the heavy door clicked shut. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows in rhythmic flashes. The silence in the car was identical to the silence at table 18, uncomplicated, devoid of expectation, and deeply comfortable. $90,000, Chin Hae said quietly, his gaze fixed on the passing streetlights. He wasn't asking a question, he was confirming the data. Grace rested her head against the cool glass. $90,000 for the venue, another $12,000 for the catering upgrades my stepmother authorized yesterday, the floral arrangements, the dress she was married in. She didn't sound bitter. She sounded exhausted, stripped of the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation. I stopped keeping the exact tally when it crossed 110. She closed her eyes, the rhythm of the road humming beneath them. It was my escape fund, 5 years of private savings. I had a one-way ticket to Seoul ready to book. Chin Hae turned his head, observing the quiet exhaustion in her profile. He knew exactly what it felt like to be the engine that powered everyone else's existence. He oversaw a global workforce of 30,000 employees, managing an international tech portfolio that demanded his unrelenting vigilance. His board, his partners, his own family, they all looked to him to absorb the pressure, to fund the expansions, to never break down. It was a suffocating gilded cage built on the expectation of infinite capacity. He saw that same heavy, invisible machinery wrapped around Grace Vance, only hers had been weaponized by the very people who should have protected her. The people who build the foundation rarely get to enjoy the house, Chin Hae murmured, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. but they are also the only ones who know precisely where the load-bearing walls are and how to dismantle them. Grace opened her eyes, turning to look at him. The glow of a passing streetlight illuminated the sharp, sudden understanding between them. The estate ledger was reconciled. The $90,000 wedding was paid for. The final, crushing obligation had been met. I'm done building for them. The town car glided through the Chicago night, carrying two architects of other people's empires, as Grace finally decided to let her family's structure fall. The town car idled at the curb of her apartment building. Grace stepped out into the quiet Chicago night, the heavy velvet doors of the Meridian Grand Ballroom feeling like a lifetime away. She didn't look back as the car pulled away, leaving her alone on the pavement. Her apartment was dark, silent, and aggressively functional. It lacked the opulent, suffocating clutter of Victoria's estate. It was a space built for efficiency, not display. Grace didn't bother turning on the overhead lights. She dropped her keys on the counter, unzipped her leather briefcase, and placed her laptop on the cold granite of the kitchen island. The digital clock in the corner of the screen read 11:52 p.m. The wedding reception was likely hitting its peak. Victoria would be orchestrating the champagne toast. Chloe would be posing for her third outfit change. They were operating under the assumption that the financial engine running their lives was a permanent, unbreakable machine. Grace opened the Vance family estate ledger one final time. She bypassed the reconciliation tabs and navigated directly to the administrative banking portal. Her keystrokes were sharp, deliberate, echoing in the quiet kitchen. She didn't hesitate as she accessed the primary trust controls. With a series of precise commands, she initiated a total asset freeze. She didn't stop there. Grace was a portrait corporate forensic accountant. She dismantled financial illusions for a living. She drafted a formal legal petition for a comprehensive forensic audit of her late father's estate, citing the documented, unauthorized withdrawals she had painstakingly tracked over the last 4 years. She attached the final, devastating ledger as her primary exhibit. She hit submit. The confirmation screen glowed in the dim room. The accounts were locked. The credit lines were severed. The $90,000 wedding was the last invoice the Vance family would ever extract from her. The structural walls of Victoria's gilded cage had just been cleanly, legally demolished. Grace leaned back against the counter, closing the legal portal. The sudden absence of obligation was disorienting, bringing a strange, hollow weightlessness. She had spent 7 years carrying the crushing debt of her father's legacy, and it had taken exactly 4 minutes to set it down. She opened a new browser tab. The funds she had wired to the venue were gone, but the severed estate line meant her future income was finally entirely her own. She navigated to an international airline portal. Her fingers moved swiftly over the keys, bypassing the budget options she usually restricted herself to. Chicago O'Hare to Seoul Incheon, direct. She didn't agonize over the dates. She selected a departure, entered her personal card information, and finalized the transaction. The digital ticket confirmation appeared on the screen, crisp and undeniable. Grace closed the laptop. She finally took off her glasses, left them beside the machine, and for the first time in 7 years, she went to sleep owing absolutely nothing to anyone. The official findings arrived on a Tuesday, delivered in a sterile, encrypted PDF from the state auditor's office. Grace opened the file with the exact same detached precision she utilized for her corporate clients. The numbers were laid out in stark black and white, completely stripped of Victoria's endless justifications and aesthetic excuses. $110,000. It wasn't just the swan ice sculptures or the luxury bridal suite upgrades. It was 4 years of systemic, unauthorized siphoning. Victoria had treated the primary estate trust like a private slush fund, quietly funneling capital into country club dues, designer wardrobes, and extravagant vacations, all while handing Grace the overdue mortgage notices to cover from her own grueling hours at the firm. The state audit didn't just expose the theft, it triggered an automatic, irrevocable legal lock on every financial line bearing the Vance name. The fallout was instantaneous. Grace's phone began vibrating against her desk at 9:14 a.m., the screen illuminated with Victoria's contact ID. Grace didn't reach for it. She simply watched the device buzz its way across the polished granite, the aggressive rhythm a perfect reflection of her stepmother's sudden panic. When the call went to voicemail, the text messages began. They started as haughty, impatient demands. "There is a ridiculous glitch with my platinum card at the spa. Fix it immediately." 20 minutes later, the tone fractured into alarm. "The bank manager is saying the estate trust is frozen. Call them and clear this up right now." By noon, Chloe had joined the barrage. The newlyweds' messages were frantic, rapid-fire bursts of panic, demanding to know why the travel agency had abruptly canceled her first-class honeymoon itinerary to Bora Bora due to a rejected wire transfer. The gilded illusion was collapsing in real time. The foundation was crumbling the exact second Grace decided to stop holding up the walls. For 7 years, a ringing phone meant a crisis only Grace was expected to solve. It meant zeroing out her own bank account, rearranging ledgers in the dead of night, and sacrificing her own peace to maintain their flawless public facade. Now, it was just noise. Grace reached out and picked up the vibrating device. She didn't read the latest paragraph of fury from Victoria. She simply swiped down to the control center and tapped the crescent moon icon. The screen went black. The silence in her apartment was immediate, profound, and absolute. She didn't feel a dramatic surge of vindictive triumph, nor did she feel the familiar heavy weight of guilt. She just felt incredibly light. Grace set the silent phone face down on the counter, turned her attention back to her laptop, and opened a blank corporate registration form. The Vance family ledger was finally closed. It was time to build an empire of her own. 4 months is a precise measurement of time. In a corporate quarter, it is exactly enough time to liquidate a failing asset, restructure a board, or dissolve a toxic legacy. For Grace Vance, it was the exact amount of time required to build an empire of her own. The frosted glass door of her new high-rise office bore 2 simple words: Vance Advisory. There was no heavy mahogany, no ostentatious floral arrangements, and absolutely no velvet. The space was sleek, ruthlessly functional, and bathed in the unfiltered natural light of the Chicago skyline. Grace sat at the head of a sweeping glass conference table, her laptop open, dissecting the financial architecture of a mid-tier logistics firm. She wasn't hidden behind a marble pillar in the basement. She was the focal point of the room. The quiet hum of the office was broken by a soft, deliberate knock. Grace didn't flinch. She locked the spreadsheet cell and looked up. "Come in." The heavy glass doors swung open. Chin-Hae Park stepped into the office, carrying the exact same quiet, unyielding authority he had brought to table 18. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, his dark eyes sweeping the minimalist space with a swift, calculating approval. He didn't offer a polite, empty congratulations on the new firm. He didn't waste her time on pleasantries. He walked directly to the conference table, reached into his briefcase, and placed a thick, sealed legal portfolio on the glass surface between them. Park Global is initiating a comprehensive international asset review across our entire tech division, Chin-Hae said smoothly, his voice a low anchor in the bright room. "I require an independent forensic audit. I need someone who understands exactly where the load-bearing walls are and who isn't afraid to tell me if my own foundation is compromised." Grace looked at the heavy portfolio, then up at Chin-Hae. He wasn't offering charity to a marginalized woman. He wasn't throwing a lifeline to a struggling startup. The contract sitting on her table was a brutal, high-stakes corporate maneuver, and he was handing it to the only architect he trusted to execute it. She rested her hands on the glass, her posture impeccable. My baseline retainer for an international review starts at $150,000, and my firm dictates the reporting timeline. Chin-Hei's expression remained perfectly still, but a faint, unmistakable flicker of respect warmed his dark eyes. The terms are already in the contract, including your premium. Grace reached for the portfolio, the solid weight of the document grounding her in this new reality. She wasn't quietly funding someone else's illusion. She was commanding her own undeniable worth. "Review the terms at your convenience," Chin-Hei said, taking a half-step back. He paused, his gaze meeting hers with a steady, leveling intensity that stripped away every remaining shadow of her past. "And when you are finished, I would like to take you to dinner, as an equal partner." Grace looked at the billionaire who had walked away from a $90,000 celebration just to find her in the margins. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to shrink to fit the frame. 8 o'clock, Grace said, evenly. And that concludes Grace's journey from Table 18 to the top of her own empire. If you loved watching her dismantle her toxic family's illusion and claim her own worth, make sure to hit that like button. It's the best way to support these original, serialized stories. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter of our upcoming fictions. Grace's journey took her all the way from Chicago to Seoul, and this community is just as global. Drop a comment down below and let me know exactly where in the world you are watching from today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next story.